Well, we are continuing our study in the book of Ephesians. We're in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. And I'd imagine that if you've been in the church for a very long time, you know these verses. You may have even memorized them because these two verses summarize the heart of the gospel message. In fact, the entire chapter 2 is a great summary of who we are and our situation and who God is and how in Jesus Christ He solves the problem and the fixes that we got ourselves into. In verses 8 and 9, they summarize how we can be reconciled to God and enter into fellowship with Him. Now the church, when it rediscovers old truth, are always renewed. It's not new truths that restore the church. It's returning to our foundations. And the doctrines of grace are always those doctrines that the church is wandering away from that we constantly have to be turning back to. With that as background, then let's hear from God's word, Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. Thus far, the reading of God's holy word. We'll just be looking at the first phrase, for by grace, and you may have noticed the title of the sermon is Sola Gratia, which is the Latin for grace alone. Why do you come to church this afternoon? Some people come to church because they want to hear a sermon that is full of hell, fire, and brimstone. Because they figure that the worse they feel, and the more guilty they feel, and the more promises they make to never do those things again, that they've definitely done their bit to restore their relationship with God, and so they can move on. But nothing could be further from the truth. Other people come to church because they want the steps for living a better life. They'd like to hear a sermon about 3 ways you can improve your marriage, 10 ways you can raise kids that won't be wayward, 5 financial lessons that you should build into your life. And you think, I'm going to take notes, I'm going to write down those 5 steps, and I'm going to start applying it to my life because the Bible is full of wisdom, and certainly if we live by those steps, that will improve our lives. The problem with that approach is that that is a DIY approach to religion. Do it yourself. And you'll never get there. In fact, if you've ever taken that kind of approach to reforming your life, how far do you get? Not very. Other people come to church because they want to be encouraged. You want to leave here feeling like you've been motivated, you've been inspired, you can go out and face the world and what you have coming before you. But that motivation doesn't last because it doesn't really go to the heart of the issue. The one message that we need to hear but that we least understand and should hear is a message of grace. A message of grace. Do you know why we don't want to hear a message of grace? Because grace is offensive. It's particularly offensive to religious folk like us. Now, I'm assuming that if you're in church on Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock, you're religious. So grace is offensive to us. And let me prove it to you with 2 parables of Jesus. The parable of the prodigal son. The son demands his part of the inheritance from his father. He takes it. He blows it. Wine, women, and song in a far-off country. The older brother, what's he doing? He's at home working hard, taking care of the family business, doing everything his father asked him to do. The son comes home because, the younger son, because he's out of money, there's a famine, no one's feeding him, and he said, I'd be better off at home as a servant than out here on my own. The father greets him. He hugs him. He says, we're having a party, invite everyone in the neighborhood over. The older brother coming back to the house that evening after a long day at work, hears the music. He calls one of the servants over and says, what's going on? He says, your brother has come home. What do you think his face looked like? And we're throwing a party. The older brother was offended, and you would be too, wouldn't you? How can you throw a party for that guy after all that he's done, and he's out in the barn and won't come home? The second parable that Jesus tells is the parable of the landowner who goes out in the morning and he hires laborers to work in his vineyard. Early in the morning, he goes out and he hires a group of men, sets a price, they go to work for him. The next hour, he goes back to the market. There's more people who need work. He hires them, tells them to go out into the field. The next hour, He goes to the market, hires them, they go out in the field. This continues to the very last hour of the day. What time y'all get off? 4:30, 5? 4 o'clock. He hires more people, sends them out to work. Now, if somebody hires you in the marketplace at 4 o'clock to go out and work, how long do you think it takes before you get to the land, you get your act together, and you kind of know what you're doing? Half hour, right? So the first half hour, their last hour, they just started work. And at the end of the day, the landowner lines everyone up, but there's something strange about the order of that line. You know who's the first in line according to the landowner's selection? The people he called to work at the last hour. Now, you and I have been there all day. What are we? Offended. This isn't fair. So he pays them, then he pays the next group, and he finally gets to us. And what we notice, he paid the ones that worked the last hour the same thing we agreed to work for the whole day. And what happens? We get paid the same thing. Are you offended? You say, that's not fair. Well, if you understand grace, you know this one thing for certain. It is not fair. It is not fair. Those who are least likely to understand grace are those of us who've been raised in the church. Isn't it strange that you can spend your whole life in the church and never understand how the gospel works? We come out with some pretty strange stuff because grace is just too difficult to believe in. And what we do, instead of resting on grace, we rest on our performance and pretending. Now, all of you good church people, you say, we don't do that. Should we ask the people out on the street what they think we do? Far often they would agree with us that we're just playing and pretending. We mess up grace so many ways. We think of it so differently and unbiblically. Some people believe that grace is a reward for good behavior. If that were true, then we have to change the parables. It should be the older brother who the party is thrown for, and the younger brother should be working as a servant, right? It should be that the ones who worked all day get double pay and are paid first and are praised by the master. But it's not. Do you know how you know if you believe that grace is a reward? Because grace can't be reward because it's undeserved merit. Is by how the way you answer this question. If you were to die today and stand before God and he were to say to you, why should I let you into heaven? And you said anything like, I haven't been really that bad. I'm fairly good. Do you know what grace means to you? It's a reward for your good behavior. But that is not what grace is. Grace is not a reward. It is completely undeserved, and we could do nothing to deserve it. Now, others believe that grace is God meeting you halfway. And you hear things, if you'll try your very best, if you'll work hard, if you'll believe, if you'll do this and that, when you go to the end of yourself, God will be waiting for you there and help you across. Those of us who believe that about grace, we have a motto, and this is what it is. And a lot of people think this is a saying that's found in the Bible. God helps those who helps himself. Can anybody give me the book and verse that's found in the Bible? It's not in the Bible. But yet so many of us think that's exactly what it means if we're going to be in a right relationship with God. But this is a false view of grace. And it's not at all what Paul tells us about in the first verse of the chapter. Paul doesn't say you're sick and you need healing. Paul doesn't call us lazy and we need discipline. Paul doesn't call us misguided and in need of understanding. Paul says we were dead. And the only thing that we contribute to our salvation is a sin that makes it necessary. And here's something very interesting. If we are dead in our trespasses and sin, there is one thing a dead body can do. You know what that is? Stink up the place. And that's the story of a lot of our lives. We're going around stinking up the place. Others believe that grace is only for little sins. But if you're guilty of big sins, you got to solve those on your own. You've got to solve those on your own. Now, there's two problems with this view. The first is this. Nowhere in the Bible does it divide sins between big sins and little sins. It just talks about sin. And the only difference between a big sin and a little sin is the time it takes to grow. Christy and I go for a walk on this trail right up the street from us. And there was hardly any brush at the beginning of the season. But now the brush is very high. Those little brushes became what? Big brushes. That's how sin works. You know, what's the worst sin we could think of together? Murder? Is murder one of the top 10? Even though it's number 6? Murder. But you know what Jesus says about murder? He says, if you're angry in your heart towards someone, you've committed murder already. Now, this is what's even more interesting than that. If you actually kill someone, you've murdered how many times? Once. But if you've been angry at that person for years, how many times? Countless. So what we think of as little sins, oh, I'm angry at that person, is really just big sins that have yet to produce fruit in our lives. The second reason that the Bible doesn't teach there's big sin and little sins is because sin is not about our act, but our nature. Our nature. It's what's in our heart. And so we can't separate who we are from what we do. And therefore, because we are rebels against God, every act of ours is treasonous. Every act is treasonous. Even those good acts are treasonous. Others believe that grace is only for certain times in the Christian life. You know, grace, there's a grace period. When you're in a car, if you don't get back, if you're in at 8:30 on a Monday and you're in it for one day, you got to get back by when? 8:30 on a Tuesday, unless there's a grace period, maybe 30 minutes. So we think that grace is for a certain time. And one of those times is we think that grace is for when we come to Christ. You know, God will forgive you of anything before you become a Christian. But once you become a Christian, there's no more grace for you. It's all on you to perform. Sometimes we think, well, grace is for us early on in the Christian life until we kind of get our feet on the ground. He kind of helps us along, but then we're expected to be on our own. I call this training wheel grace. Any young people learning to ride a bike? Anybody learn to ride a bike? Oh, you know how to ride a bike? You're learning. Does anyone have training wheels on their bike? Yeah. Aren't you glad for those training wheels? Yes, you are, because that keeps you from what? Falling over. Most of us think of grace exactly that way. God's happy to give you training wheels for a little while, but each time you move them up a little more, and eventually you what? You take them off, and then you are on your own. But that's not what grace is. It's a misunderstanding of our salvation. You see, grace isn't for just us coming to Christ. Grace and forgiving our past sin, grace is God accepting you and forgiving you of all your sin, past, present, and future. And this is one of the most magnificent things about grace. I'm forgiven for my past sins, I'm forgiven for my present sins, and I'm forgiven for my future sins. Because all are paid for the same way by the blood of Jesus Christ on the cross. And you say, well, if all your sins are paid for, then you can do whatever you want. Yes, that's right, because you know what grace does in me? It makes me want to love the God who's forgiven me of all my sins, who set me free from them so I might live for Him and serve Him. Those who know grace don't delight and are joyful that they know Christ in that way. Now, part of the problem when we coming to Christ, we think of grace as only for coming to Christ, but we also need grace to walk with Christ. When you're born again, you are immediately declared forgiven. That's a legal status before God. You're legally declared adopted as His son or daughter. Then you are declared holy. Those are all legal standings, but what's the truth? You know it. You're not perfect. You still sin because in reality, there's a grace that takes you from where you are to where God wants you. And you must rely on Him to get you there. Far too many people have been taught you receive Jesus by grace, but you walk and live the Christian life by works, by doing religious activities that will strengthen you and make you strong. That sounds like wise advice, but it's not. Because your religious activity is putting emphasis on who? On you. Now, does religious activity have a value? Only to the point where they point you to Jesus. If you say in your prayers, God, you saw me read my Bible this week. I was at church. I've been trying to do those things that you want me to do. You sound like who in the Bible? The Pharisee who went up to the temple to pray. Remember, he stood in the middle of the temple and he said, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like other men. I've done all these good deeds, and I just wanted you to know how proud you should be of me. Is that the qualities that Christ wants to engender in your life? The fruit of the Spirit in your life? Absolutely not. Another way that people see grace is as a multiple pack of tickets. You know, you get a package of tickets Anybody go to the rodeo fair, the carnival with rodeo? Can you buy a package of tickets or do you buy one at a time? Oh, you had all-day wristbands, right? Well, we'll do it with all-day wristbands. Some people see grace that way. I've got all day to do grace, but what happens when that runs out? You see, there's no limit to God's grace, just as Paul told us about in the verse before our passage. It's the immeasurable grace of God. There's no limit to God's grace for his children. Romans 5:20 says, where sin is, grace abounded, how? All the more. And that's important for you to hear. Because most of us are living under guilt. Most of us are living under shame because somehow we think we've run out of God's grace. Because of our sin, Christ no longer loves us or cares about us, and we better get to work to get things back together. Another way that people look at grace is they see it as an endless stack of get-out-of-jail-free cards. What game is that, young people? Monopoly, right? Monopoly. Just think if you had an endless stack of get-out-of-jail-free cards. You'd do anything you want. You say, land on that. I don't care. The problem is grace doesn't do that to you. Grace changes you. Paul says to people who, after explaining what grace is, he says, should you continue in sin that grace may abound? He says, no, never. Because how can you have died to sin and still live in it? So you see, if you have any one or several of mixtures of these versions of grace in your thinking about who God is and what Jesus Christ has done for you, you don't know grace. And this is how you know if you have a dysfunctional understanding of grace: when you sin. When you sin, if you feel guilty and ashamed, too ashamed to go to Jesus, then you have a dysfunctional view of grace. Because what grace teaches you is that when you sin, you immediately go to the one who forgives you. That no amount of your repenting, promising, and trying to do better will achieve more forgiveness and more transformation than going to Jesus Christ and finding grace in him. Now, this problem with grace is something that's gone on for a long time. It's not new. You find it in the Bible with the Pharisees. They believed by their hard work they were better than others, that they were proud of how hard they worked, and they judged others. But they were far from being Christians. Paul has to write about grace in several of his books, correcting problems that the church had. To the book of Galatians, he had to say, you can't be adding things to grace because that doesn't help. Your works don't make grace any better. In the book of Romans, as Paul lays out the gospel, he has to explain grace. In the letters of the Corinthians, Paul has to correct the people's misunderstanding of grace because of their immoral behavior. Throughout church history, the church has constantly been wandering away from this doctrine of grace and understanding it. We find it in the controversy between Augustine and Pelagius. Augustine brought the church back to the truth of grace. Later on, we find it in Luther. When he nailed his 95 Theses to the wall of the Wittenberg Chapel, his main complaint was the fact that the church was selling indulgences. They were teaching that if you bought these indulgences, you were buying your way out of purgatory, in a sense nullifying the grace of God. In my lifetime, there's been a rediscovery of grace. In the Jesus movement, there was a rediscovery of grace and how many of you came to Christ during the Jesus movement in the late 60s, early 70s? Yeah. And what happens is that we learned how one is made right with God. There was a famous evangelistic method that laid out for you basically the teachings of this text. It begins with grace, telling you what it is and how it operates. And it begins with man, who we are and why we need it. Then it talks about God, that he's holy and loving. Then it talks about Christ, who he is and how he died for us. And then it talks about faith, what it is and what it is not. It's basically correcting this doctrine of grace. We see how important the teachings of grace are in this book of Ephesians, what I call the primer of the Christian faith, because the entire first 2 chapters emphasize grace. The words grace is used 12 times in the book of Ephesians, 3 times each in chapters 1 and 2. In this section of Ephesians, the refrain By grace you have been saved, it's repeated twice with just in a couple of verses, verse 5 and verse 8. Some theologians believe that this is a hymn of praise, and the refrain is, for by grace are you saved. Can you all write a song like that for us? Great. So what is grace? What is grace? Grace is not a power or a force. Sometimes we talk about it that way, but it's not. Grace is the unmerited favor. Grace is the unmerited favor of God, sovereignly given to undeserving sinners like ourselves. It is dispensed according to God's will, without any dependency on human merit or action. It means that God smiles down at His children. He is more proud of you than any of you fathers or mothers as you look at your children. And He does this not because of what we have done, but what has been done for us in Jesus Christ. And God uses all His power, might, and blessings to move you from where you are to where God wants you to be. And so this is important, because if you're going to grow in grace, you don't grow in grace by becoming stronger. You grow in grace by becoming weaker. Think of it like this. Grace is like life support. When the EMTs picked you up, you were dead. They shocked you and brought you back to life. You didn't ask them, help me. You didn't call them to say, save me. They found you and brought you back to life. They hooked you up to all of these things. They put you on a ventilator, and they're taking you to the hospital. You wake up and you say, I'm feeling better. Let me take all this stuff off. Can you? No. You're regularly and totally dependent on that. And here's the truth. You can never get off it. You cannot get off of the grace of God in Jesus Christ. You grow in grace by learning your deeper need of it. Now I want to talk about how this grace actually works in a story that Ezekiel tells us about in Ezekiel 16:3-7, the passage that was read early in our service. Have your bulletins open. Please open it, because I want to walk you through this passage to show you how grace was involved in not only the choosing of Israel, but also the choosing of us, for everyone. Now listen to what he says in verse 3. Your origins and your birth are of the land of the Canaanites, and your father was an Amorite, and your mother a Hittite. God has just slandered the Israelites. He said, you are from the wrong side of the track, and you are of the wrong people. There's nothing in your background that, would mean that you're anybody worthy of anything. Then he continues, and as for your birth, on the day that you were born, your cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to cleanse you, or rubbed with salt, or wrapped in swaddling clothes. Now, what mothers did when they gave birth to a child at that time, they did all those things. Are you going to rub your baby with salt? No. It worked back then. It's a purifier, and it dries out the skin. And all this. If you wanted your child, you did all those things. They didn't do a thing because Israel's mother did not want her. Did not want her. Is that possible? Yeah, it happens, unfortunately. And so, because they did nothing for this child, it just simply meant we're throwing it in the trash. Today, we might find the child in the dumpster or on the steps of a hospital or something like that. But in ancient days, you just walked out to a field and put your child out there because you didn't want it. Look at verse 5. No eye pitied you to do any of these things to you out of compassion for you. But you were cast out in an open field, for you were abhorred on the day that you were born. I always hear that all babies are beautiful, right? But what is said about Israel? You were abhorred. You were abhorrent. You were disgusting. Your mother didn't want you. No one walking by you wanted you. And you were left to die. Then notice verse 6. And when I passed by you and saw you wallowing in your blood, I said to you, in your blood, live. I said to you, in your blood, live. It was God moving with grace towards Israel that caused her to come alive, that caused her to survive her birth. And then notice verse 7. I made you to flourish like a plant of the field. You grew up and became tall and arrived at full adornment. And so you see the grace of God at work at every stage in the calling of Israel, and you should also see this God calling you in every stage of your life. It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter that nobody wanted you. When God gets hold of you and brings you to life, He gives you the grace to become everything that He wants you to be. Now, grace is multifaceted, and in this text we see three forms of God's grace at work. The first form or dimension of God's grace we see at work is His sovereign grace. The sovereign grace of God is seen in this passage in Ezekiel because God chooses Israel not for anything in themselves, but because He freely, out of whatever was in Him, said, I want you to live. There was no condition about the background, the morality, the abilities, or anything else. God just moved upon them and worked upon them. Nothing that was in them. Now, this is very frightening that God's grace is sovereign. Do you know what that means, God's grace is sovereign? It means that there is nothing you can do to get God's attention and manipulate. He can walk right by you and not respond at all to any of your prayers, any of your requests, any of your pleas. He has the right to do that. You say, how could He do that? I don't know. Don't you do that every day when you're out on the streets of Reno? That's the frightening news about this God. He's absolutely sovereign. You don't choose Him. In His grace, He chooses you. Now, that might be the bad news, but here's the very good news about that. If God's grace is based upon nothing in us, it means that there's nothing in us that can keep Him from not choosing us, right? It means that no matter how immoral, no matter how immodest, no matter how wicked, no matter how ugly, no matter how evil, no matter how hard and cold our hearts are, no matter what our family background is, no matter our lack of character, no matter about our present or past actions, the grace of God in Jesus Christ can find you right here, right now, and change your heart. This morning when I was out on the trail doing the early morning walk, practicing my sermon, I passed by a gentleman who Christy and I talk to quite often on the trail. His dog loves us. He comes up, we pet him and goes on. And so I said, hey, you go to church? And he says, no, I don't go to church. I said, well, I'm a pastor. Come to our church. He said, I'm an agnostic. I don't want anything to do with church. I don't want anything to do with organized religion. Does he care that God passes him by? Does he care that God hasn't poured out His grace on him? Not at all. But here's the truth. God can pour out His grace on him so his life would be transformed. And God can pour out His grace on you today, right now, no matter what you've done, no matter where you've come from, no matter what's going on in your life. If you're addicted to anything, He can set you free. If you are imprisoned by anything, He can open the doors and liberate you. He can so change every and all relationships in your life by His grace. And if you have any desire, any longing in your heart to see that change in your life, guess who's already at work in your life, and guess who is already doing a work of grace in your life? It's God. So respond to Him. Tell Him, Lord, fill me with your grace, because I'm an empty vessel and I need you. And that will be exactly what He does. The second dimension of grace that's mentioned in this chapter is saving grace. You see, saving grace is when you go from death to life. When you go from death to life. And notice what God said to Israel in her blood. Live. When our first child was born, I had the scissors. I was getting ready to cut the cord. But when she came out, the cord was wrapped twice around her neck. Don't want to frighten you. She was all purple, right? So the doctor said, stand back, we'll take over. And they cut the cord and put her on a little table, and nothing's happening. And, they gave her, did they spank her? They gave her a tap on the button. Tap on the button, she goes, and came alive. That's what the grace of God in Jesus Christ does. It brings us to life. It brings us to life so we're new people. It's something that you cannot do. It's something that Jesus does in you that changes you so completely, so radically that you look back and say, how could that ever possibly have been me? Because I see nothing like that in me. It's a work of God. It's a miracle. Just like Jesus said to Nicodemus, you must be born again. The third kind of saving grace we find in this text is sanctifying grace. Sanctifying grace. Notice verse 7. I made you to flourish. What Ezekiel, God is saying to the people of Israel is, my grace is going to grow you up. My grace takes that life that I've given you, and every moment of the day it grows you up so you become more and more like Christ. And the only way you become more and more like Christ if you rest in His grace, if you trust in His grace instead of working for Him. Now, I said that the people who have the worst problems with grace are us religious people. I was born into the church. Did you know I had 10 years of perfect attendance pins? Because I used to give out perfect attendance. And Daniel, you're probably the only one in this building that knows this. I had to go Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and other things like that. We were there. But somehow I got the idea that the Christian life was lived by believing in God and Jesus, but working as hard as I could to be good. How far do you think I got? Not very. If I was good, I was pretending. If I wasn't good, I was hiding. That's what wrong views of grace do. But when we see this idea of sanctifying grace, it means that God helps us in our weakness. And so growing in grace is when you're weak, you go to Him. Growing in grace is when you're sinful, you go to Him. Growing in grace is when you have relational problems, you go to Him. Growing in grace is when you're so mad you want to kill somebody, you have to go to Him. And it's only Him who can set you free by His grace. And here's the best news of all. What did Israel pay for this grace? What do we pay for this grace? It's a gift of God, lest anyone should boast. There's a blessing found in Numbers 6:24. It's the blessing that God commanded the priest to say over Israel. It's known as the Aaronic blessing. Not the ironic blessing, but the Aaronic, A-A-R-O-N something. Yeah. This is how it goes. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. Do you know what it means for God to lift up His face to shine upon you? It means He's not turning away from you. He's always turning towards you. His gaze is fixed upon you and He smiles. Do you know that in Jesus Christ, and because of Jesus Christ, that God smiles at you? You say, you couldn't be smiling at me today. Not after what I said. Not after what I've done. Then you don't understand grace. Because grace is receiving the gift that Jesus Christ won for you. And notice verse 26. He lifts up His countenance upon me. And that means He picks up His head. He's not staring at His notes. He picks up His head and He looks right at you and says, I love you, my child. And when you know that this is God's constant attitude towards you because of Jesus Christ, you can be at peace. You can rest in the assurance that no matter what you're going through, that Christ is with you, and He's using all those things to point you to Him.